Let's talk about the new Joker film. A film that, for all of its ambitions, seems to have become one of the most misunderstood works of recent cinema.
Joker 2 felt like a dull, bloated, and ultimately unnecessary movie.
Such a blatant middle finger directed at its own audience.
A shockingly confusing fumble.
They stretch out a paper-thin story to an excruciating 2 hours and 20 minutes.
And now we have a movie that's really difficult to describe and break down because it lacks all sense of focus.
This was a rough sit, not without its worthwhile scenes, moments, and images, but disastrous as a coherent whole.
Now, I'm not here to dissect the technicalities or to tell you whether the movie was good or bad in some objective sense. Instead, I want to explore why this film in particular seems to have sparked such polarizing reactions, why it's facing bad reviews, why it's underperforming at the box office, and, crucially, whether we as viewers are missing something essential in the process, as Arthur said in the end of the first film.
You couldn't get it.
First off, let's acknowledge that this film had an almost impossible task ahead of it. The original Joker was a surprise hit that tapped into a lot of cultural anxieties. So naturally, when the news of a sequel broke, expectations were sky high. But what if Todd Phillips and his crews never set out to meet those expectations in the first place? What if it was always meant to be something different, something less accessible and more challenging? Here's the first thing that I think we need to consider. This is not the Joker sequel a lot of people were expecting or perhaps even wanted. It's not another dive into a chaotic rise of a supervillain. And maybe that's the root of the issue. We as audiences, some perhaps comic book lovers, are often uncomfortable with changes, especially if it's done in a sequel. We want the Joker to be the Joker. We want Harley Quinn to be Harley Quinn. And for the film to fit neatly into our expectations of what a follow-up should be. But this, I think, is what Todd Phillips and his crews resist at every turn. If anything, Todd Phillips himself, even Joaquin Phoenix, has previously stated how they are uninterested in the idea of a sequel for the Joker, and if they were able to make one, or even forced to make one due to how successful the original film was, I can imagine that they'd want to do something so unapologetic in its vision in order to be motivated enough to do it at all.
If you're privileged enough to get to do this, and you're privileged enough to get to do it again with these kind of actors, you have to be bold and you have to take risks. And that was kind of the directive. And then the other directive to the crew was, I want the movie to feel like it was made by crazy people.
This brings us to the musical element, something that threw a lot of people off. Why would a sequel to such a dark and grounded film suddenly be a musical? When it was first announced, this creative vision sounded like a total blunder. But here's the thing. The songs in this film may be intended for us to see the chaos and delusion inside Arthur and Harley's minds. Those musical moments are not just theatrical. They are deliberately disorienting. The songs don't function as a catchy showstoppers, but as windows into the fractured psyche of the characters. Maybe they are not meant to be enjoyed in the traditional sense, but instead to make us feel uncomfortable, trapped in their delusions with them.
Well, it was really about taking the standards and taking things that we've all seen before and kind of putting them through Arthur's eyes. And so they all feel, the music to us feels a little bit off, a little left-footed. Some of the numbers, if you can call them that, the dancing feels a little off, a little left-footed. So I think all of it, you know, both movies, everything in both movies, to me, is run through the lens of Arthur. So, you know, what does a musical look like run through the lens of Arthur? And that's kind of...
In the end, they produced a film that asks more questions than it answers, that confuses us rather than offering a clean narrative arc. Maybe that's why it's getting such mixed reviews, because we're not used to feeling this loss or this implicated in the story's madness. Now, the box office failure. Could it be that audiences are rejecting the film because it didn't give them what they thought they were buying the ticket for? They expected this film to be chaos, but a familiar kind of chaos like they saw in the original film. Instead, they got something more introspective, more surreal, maybe even more intimate than they were prepared for. It's almost like the film is saying, this is how it feels to live inside the mind of a madman. When the first Joker was a character study tightly focused on one man's descent into madness, this sequel is a more diffuse, abstract exploration of shared psychosis. It's not about building towards a climactic confrontation, nor does it have the kind of clear arc that many comic book films rely on. The musical format only adds to the confusion for some viewers who may have been expecting a more straightforward psychological thriller. Now, I'm not saying that this year's Joker is without its flaws. Of course, there are some legitimate criticisms to be made about its pacing, the structure and execution, but I wonder if, in our rush to critique, we are overlooking how the film actually intends to show the sense of madness inside the minds of our two main characters, and yet we just don't get it. In the end, this film isn't a film that wants to be neatly understood. Maybe it failed at the opening box office because it dared to show some madness in a way that doesn't cater into our expectations. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes it more interesting than we're giving it credit for.